Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
je remercie
I thank
la secrétaire générale adjointe
the
aux affaires
Undersecretary
politiques,
General for Political
le haut
Affairs,
commissaire adjoint aux
the
réfugiés et le
Assistant
directeur
High
général
Commissioner
de
for
l'OMS
Refugees,
pour leurs
and the
interventions.
Director General of the
Celles-ci
WHO for their
démontrent,
briefings.
avec l'impartialité
These
et la rigueur
briefings
qui
reveal with the
caractérisent le travail des
impartiality and the
Nations
rigor
Unies,
that the United
la
Nations is
réalité
known
de
for in
cette
its work,
guerre
the reality
menée
of this
depuis 3
war
semaines
that has been
par la
waged for
Fédération de
3
Russie.
weeks now by the Russian
Cette
Federation.
réalité,
The
c'est la
reality
mort de civils
is the
innocents
deaths of
ainsi
innocent
que de
civilians as
journalistes
well
et de
as
personnels
journalists
médicaux.
and medical personnel.
C'est le chaos créé partout
It
en
is the
Ukraine
chaos
et
created
bien
throughout the
au-delà,
country and
notamment
well
par
beyond its
l'aggravation
borders,
de
in
l'insécurité
particular
alimentaire dans le
because of the
monde.
worsening food
Ce sont
insecurity
les
throughout the
millions
world.
de vies brisées de
It's the
toutes celles et tous
millions of
ceux qui sont
lives
forcés de fuir leur
disrupted
foyer
of
et
those
qui ne trouvent
who were
répit
forced
ni
to
dans les
flee
hôpitaux
their
ni
homes
dans les
and who
écoles.
find no respite
Avec
whether
ses
in
partenaires
hospitals
européens,
or in
la France
schools.
continuera de se
With its European
mobiliser
partners,
pour
France
l'accueil
will
de ces
continue to
réfugiés.
mobilize
Elle
to welcome
continuera
these
d'apporter son
refugees, and we will
soutien aux
continue
Ukrainiens.
to provide
Elle a
support to
débloqué 100
Ukrainians,
millions
and to this
d'euros
end
à
we
cette
have
fin. La
disbursed
France
100 million
appelle la
euros.
Russie à cesser
France
immédiatement
calls on
cette
Russia
guerre
to
sanguinaire
immediately cease its
et à se
bloody war
conformer
and
à
to
l'ordonnance de la Cour
comply with
internationale de
the
justice
International
rendue
Court of
hier.
Justice's order
Elle
issued
condamne dans
yesterday.
les termes les plus forts
We
le
condemn
siège de
in the
plusieurs villes
strongest
ukrainiennes
terms
et
the
les bombardements
siege against
indiscriminés
Ukrainian
visant les populations
cities
civiles.
and the
Elle
indiscriminate
appelle la Russie à se
bombings
conformer au droit
targeting
international
civilian
humanitaire,
populations.
à protéger
We
les
call
civils et les
on
infrastructures civiles
Russia to abide
et à
by
permettre
international
l'acheminement de
humanitarian law
l'aide.
to protect
Les
civilians and
attaques
civilian
contre les
infrastructure
hôpitaux
and to
sont
allow safe
constitutives
and
de crimes de
unfettered
guerre.
delivery of
La France
humanitarian
condamne
assistance. Attacks
également
against
les
hospitals
actions qui ont
rise
pris
to the
les
level of
journalistes pour
war
cible
crimes, and we
et elle
also
rappelle
condemn the
l'obligation qui
targeting of
incombe aux
journalists,
forces
and we
armées de les
recall the
protéger.
obligation of armed
La
forces
France
to
est
protect them.
particulièrement préoccupée
We
par
are
les
particularly
informations faisant
concerned
état
at
de
reports
l'emploi
of
par la Russie de bombes à
Russia's use
sous-munitions.
of cluster munitions.
Elle condamne une fois de plus
We
le
once
soutien
again
que le
condemn
régime biélorusse
the
apporte
support
à
of the
cette guerre
Belarusian
meurtrière.
regime
Elle dénonce
for this
l'utilisation par
deadly
la Russie
offensive, and
de
we
mercenaires,
also
notamment syriens,
condemn the use by
qui
the
ne
Russian
saurait
Federation
exonérer
of
la Russie
mercenaries,
de sa
notably Syrian
responsabilité. Celle-ci
mercenaries.
devra rendre
This
compte de ses crimes. Nous
is
saluons
in no
l'ouverture
way
d'une
an
enquête
absolution of
par le
Russia
bureau du
and its
procureur de la Cour
responsibility.
pénale internationale.
Russia must give an
La
account for its
France
crimes.
dénonce
We
enfin le séisme de la
welcome
Russie qui
the
prétend à
opening
New
of an
York
investigation by the
se
Office of the
soucier de
Prosecutor
la
of the
situation
ICC
humanitaire en
into the
Ukraine
situation. France
alors qu'elle en est la
denounces the
cause unique.
cynicism of Russia,
Le
which
projet de résolution
claims
russe
to
ne
be
trompe
concerned
personne.
at the
Il ne
humanitarian
doit pas être
situation in
soutenu.
Ukraine, where it
Le
is,
soutenir serait
I guess
donner
it
un
is the only one
blanc-seing à la
responsible.
Russie pour qu'elle poursuive cette guerre. Monsieur le Président,
If we
malgré
support
les
their draft
destructions et les
resolution,
souffrances,
it would be giving
la
them the
guerre en
green light to
Ukraine
continue their war.
a révélé
Mr.
une autre
President,
réalité.
despite the destruction and
Le
suffering, the
peuple
war in
ukrainien
Ukraine
fait
also
preuve d'une
revealed another
résistance
reality.
admirable. La France salue son
The
courage
people of
et
Ukraine
celui des
are
autorités
showing
ukrainiennes.
admirable
La communauté
resistance, and we
internationale est
welcome their
unie dans
courage
la
and
condamnation
the
de
courage of their
l'agression.
authorities.
De nombreux pays, dont la
The
France,
international
ont
community is
immédiatement pris des
united in
mesures
its
visant
massive
les autorités
condemnation of
russes et
Russian
les cercles
aggression, and
économiques
many
proches du
countries, including
pouvoir,
France, have
pour les
immediately taken
priver
measures
des ressources
targeting Russian
et les
authorities and the
empêcher
economic circles
des
close to
moyens de
Russian
poursuivre
power
cette
to
guerre.
cut off access to their
Ces
resources and
sanctions
to
ont
prevent
déjà
them from
démontré leur
continuing this war.
efficacité et
These sanctions have
continueront à être
already proved
renforcées pour
effective and
renchérir
will be further
le coût de la
strengthened
guerre
to
jusqu'à
make
ce que
it
les
more
autorités russes
expensive to
renoncent à la
wage this
violence.
war and
Je vous
until
remercie,
the
Monsieur le
Russian
Président.
authorities give up their.
أشكر ممثل
I
فرنسا
thank
على
the
بيانه
representative
وأعطي
of
الكلمة
France
لممثلة
for his
إيرلندا.
statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you, President. I also would like to thank Under-Secretary General DiCarlo, Assistant High Commissioner Mazou, and Director General Dr. Tedros for their very sobering briefings. Their messages are grim, very grim. We commend all humanitarian organizations working to alleviate the man-made catastrophe being visited on Ukraine. President, the cause of this catastrophe is clear. 3 short weeks ago, as we sat in this very chamber, as the Secretary General pleaded for peace, the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine. Since then, we have witnessed wanton devastation in a sovereign, independent nation with no regard for human life. To date, over 3 million people have had to flee Ukraine, becoming refugees in neighboring countries. We heard today 90% of those forced out of their homes and into uncertainty are women and children. Families torn apart. At least 2 million people are internally displaced, increasingly vulnerable and in need of immediate support. Ordinary people traumatized by a cruel and reckless war. Women and girls face heightened risk of being subjected to sexual and gender-based violence, including rape and trafficking. Their right to protection is being ignored. The destruction of the basic services all of us here at this table take for granted, food, water, sanitary systems, health and education, is having a devastating effect in Ukraine. Civilian casualties, we know, are in the thousands. Irish journalist Pierre Sachevsky was tragically killed alongside Ukrainian journalist Sasha Kushnova. They were both working to shine a light on Ukraine's plight. Our thoughts are with their families and every grieving and suffering Ukrainian family. Courageous journalists are showing the horrific impact of Russian aggression. I salute the free media putting their lives on the line to show us the truth. The humanitarian impact of this war is being felt around the world. It will affect the food security of countries heavily reliant on Ukrainian agricultural products, including in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. It will cause severe harm far beyond the borders of Ukraine. President, I find it a damning indictment that this council has to plead with the Russian Federation not to deprive civilian populations of food and water, not to deny them the basic infrastructure they need for daily existence, for survival. It's a damning indictment that we in this council have not been able to speak with a united voice to save innocent lives in this war. President, the images from a besieged Mariupol are shocking. We see once again that urban warfare takes the heaviest toll on civilians. We deplore the targeting of healthcare facilities, doctors taken hostage, life-saving care interfered with by military forces. Last week's attack by Russian forces on a maternity hospital in Mariupol plumbed new deaths, resulting in the death of a mother and her newborn baby, a baby that never had a chance. We have to ask how many more. The residents of Mariupol are now melting snow or siphoning water from heating systems to quench their thirst. They're cutting down trees for firewood for cooking and to stay warm in freezing night temperatures. The city's supermarkets emptied because the basic necessities of life cannot be safely brought into the city. It is chilling to think that the suffering forced on Mariupol may be visited on other Ukrainian cities. There can be no justification for this brutal aggression. It should never have been perpetrated. It must be stopped. Ireland calls on the Russian Federation to comply with its obligations to protect civilian healthcare facilities and medical and humanitarian personnel. It must facilitate the safe passage and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance, including medical and food supplies. Whatever is agreed or not agreed on humanitarian corridors or other measures, civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected under international humanitarian law. This applies both to those who choose to leave and those who choose to remain. Surely, the most basic respect for human life must mean something to the aggressor even now. Let's be clear, the provision of humanitarian assistance is not dependent on a ceasefire. It is dependent on those bombing cities doing the right thing in accordance with their obligations. President, attacks directed against civilians and civilian objects indiscriminate attacks and disproportionate attacks are all prohibited under international humanitarian law. Ireland remains gravely concerned by the humanitarian harm arising from use of explosive weapons in populated areas in Ukraine. There have been reports of the use of cluster munitions and thermobaric weapons by Russian military forces. These weapons cause mass casualties. They pose great risk for civilians when deployed in urban areas, including long after fighting has ceased. Their use is unconscionable. Equally, any use of white phosphorus against civilians or civilian infrastructure is abhorrent and contrary to international law. President, not only is Russia's war in Ukraine morally wrong, it is illegal. Yesterday, in granting Ukraine's request for provisional measures against the Russian Federation, the International Court of Justice was clear, it was emphatic. Russia must immediately suspend the military operations in Ukraine. In light of the court's decision, which is binding on the Russian Federation, which it cannot ignore, Ireland once again calls on the Russian Federation to comply with its obligations under international law and immediately end its aggression, unconditionally withdraw its forces from the entire territory of Ukraine, and refrain from further threat or use of force of any kind against Ukraine or any other member state. President, colleagues, for 3 long weeks, diplomacy has proved unavailing. For 3 long weeks, the world has watched this war with horror. Yet, we believe there is still a chance for peace. We urge the Russian Federation to do the right thing and commit to the diplomatic path in good faith. It is never too late to do the right thing. Thank you.
أشكر ممثلة إيرلندا على بيانها وأعطي الكلمة لممثلة النرويج.
Thank you, President. I join others in thanking briefers for their sobering presentations. 3 weeks ago, Russia launched its military aggression and invaded Ukraine. And since the start of the war, a Ukrainian child has become a refugee almost every second. Over 3 million civilians have crossed the borders into neighboring countries seeking protection, and over 2 million people are displaced inside Ukraine. They are fleeing from the horrors of Russia's unjust and illegal war against Ukraine, from the destructive power of one of the world's biggest war machines, from Russia's shelling of homes, schools, and hospitals, from Russia's indiscriminate use of explosive weapons and their deplorable use of cluster bombs, weapons that destroy cities, killing civilians even while they are fleeing or hiding. The human suffering is unacceptable. We encourage countries to keep their borders open to all those seeking safety outside Ukraine without discrimination. And we commend the generosity of the neighboring countries and their solidarity with those fleeing the war. Many of those fleeing are in a vulnerable situation, as we heard from Dr. Tedros, at risk of sexual and gender-based violence, trafficking, and other forms of exploitation. Traumatized children and adults in need of mental and psychosocial support. We encourage the humanitarian organization to give priority to these issues in their response. President, civilians must be protected at all times, and humanitarian and medical workers must also be protected and allowed safe, rapid, and unhindered access to people in need. The protection of civilians and humanitarian access are not a matter of choice. They are legal obligation under international humanitarian law, obligation which must be respected. And those responsible for violation must be held accountable. President, Russia's war is causing despair and suffering with global implication. Russia is responsible for the increased food prices and higher risk of food insecurity that many countries now face. Russia's war against Ukraine will further exacerbate humanitarian crisis, death and disaster for people across continents. Russia, and Russia alone, bears the sole responsibility for the war and humanitarian crisis. Russia must stop its military aggression against Ukraine. Russia must comply with the order by the International Court of Justice to immediately suspend its military operation in Ukraine. If Russia cares about the humanitarian suffering this war is causing, then Russia should stop its senseless and illegal war. The Russian draft resolution has no credibility. It will not stop the war and the suffering. We echo the call of the Secretary General that political dialogue, negotiation, and mediation are the only way forward. We need to see genuine talks that translate into concrete results on the ground, and they must be inclusive. We need to see women included meaningfully in all talks, negotiation, and mediation efforts. And for the sake of humanity, this war must stop. Thank you.
أشكر ممثلة النرويج على بيانها وأعطي الكلمة لممثل
I
الهند.
thank the representative from Norway, and India has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me thank USG DiCarlo, UNHCR Assistant High Commissioner Mazo, and WHO Director General Dr. Ghebreyesus for their respective briefing on the security and humanitarian situation in Ukraine. India continues to remain deeply concerned at the ongoing situation, which has progressively deteriorated since the beginning of the hostilities. The conflict has resulted in death of civilians, displacement of thousands of people internally, and outflow of more than 3 million refugees to neighboring countries. The humanitarian situation has worsened, particularly in the conflict zones. There is an urgent need, therefore, to address the humanitarian needs of the affected population. In this regard, we support the initiatives of the UN and its agencies who have mobilized whatever is possible in the shortest possible time frame. We hope the international community will continue to respond positively to the humanitarian needs of the people of Ukraine, including through extending generous support to Secretary General's flash appeal and the Regional Refugee Response Plan on Ukraine. Keeping in view the dire humanitarian situation unfolding in Ukraine, India has already sent over 90 tons of humanitarian supplies to Ukraine and its neighbors as a part of the 9 separate tranche of humanitarian assistance delivered thus far. These supplies have included medicines and other essential relief material. We are in the process of identifying other such requirements and sending further supplies in the coming days. India has ensured the safe return of about 22,500 Indians from Ukraine. We have also assisted nationals from 18 other countries in that process. We are deeply appreciative of the facilitation rendered by the authorities of Ukraine and its neighboring countries in ensuring their safe return. Allow me to underscore that it is important that the humanitarian action is always guided by the principles of humanitarian assistance, which is humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These measures should not be politicized. We reiterate our call for immediate cessation of hostilities across Ukraine. Our Prime Minister has reiterated this on several occasions and called for immediate ceasefire and emphasized that there is no option but the path of dialogue and diplomacy. We stand ready to continue to engage on these objectives in the Security Council as well as with the parties in the coming days. We continue to underline the need to respect the UN Charter, international law, and the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of states. I thank you, Mr. President.
أشكر ممثل الهند على بيانه وأعطي
I
الكلمة
thank the
لممثل
representative of
غانا.
India, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana. The representative of Ghana.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this meeting
and also thank the distinguished briefers for the updated information on the prevailing humanitarian situation in Ukraine. I also welcome the participation in this meeting of the representatives of Poland and Ukraine. Mr. President, Ghana reiterates once more the call on the Russian Federation for an unconditional and immediate ceasefire and for the withdrawal of all its invading troops from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. The cessation of hostilities is critical to save lives and prevent further devastation to the Ukrainian people. It remains fundamental to addressing the worsening humanitarian situation. We remain deeply concerned about the military escalations and the disproportionate use of unconventional munitions in bombarding the cities and civilian populated areas of Ukraine, and we are disheartened by the trauma that the situation has caused, especially to the aged, women, and children. The parties to the conflict must urgently commit to a humanitarian pause to enable the evacuation and safe passage of civilians and facilitate the delivery of food, medicine, and other essential services to those in critical need and those who have been caught up in the cities under siege. We also deplore the attacks on medical facilities and call for the protection of humanitarian workers and medical personnel. We urge the parties to comply with their commitments under international law and international humanitarian law, in particular, the provisions of the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949 relating to the protection of civilian persons in the time of war. We continue to urge the parties to accept the path of diplomacy and dialogue in resolving their security concerns. We believe that the good offices of the Secretary General should be leveraged to facilitate a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Mr. President, in concluding, I wish to emphasize that the interest and safety of the Ukrainian people should be prioritized and must be at the forefront of the actions of this Council and all other international actions. I thank you for your kind attention.
أشكر ممثلة غانا على بيانها وأعطي الكلمة
I thank the
لممثل
representative of Ghana, and I now give the floor to Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Monsieur le Président, je
Mr.
remercie
President,
Madame
I'd like to
Di
thank
Carlo,
Madam
le
Di
docteur
Carlo,
Tedros
Dr.
Adhanom
Tedros
Ghebreyesus
Adhanom
et
Ghebreyesus,
Monsieur Raoul Mazou
Mr.
pour
Raouf
leurs
Mazou
exposés
for
sur
their
la
briefings
situation
on the
humanitaire en
situation,
Ukraine.
the humanitarian situation in Ukraine.
L'intensification des combats et
Intensification
l'exode massif
of
des populations
fighting
civiles
and
qui
the
en
massive
découlent,
exodus of
la
civilians
détérioration
ensuing
des
from this,
conditions
and
de
the
vie
deterioration
et
in
des
the living
conditions sanitaires
conditions
de ceux qui
and
décident
health
de
conditions of
rester,
those who
les risques
decide
de
to remain,
maladies liés
the
à la
risks
rupture
of
de fourniture de
disease
services
because
publics de
of
base
the disruption
sont
in
autant
basic
de sujets
services
de
are
préoccupation.
all causes for concern.
Nous exhortons à
We
nouveau
once
toutes
again
les parties à
call on
respecter
all
les
the
dispositions du
parties
droit
to
international
comply with
humanitaire,
the provisions
à
of
garantir
international
le respect et
humanitarian
la
law and to
protection des
ensure respect
populations,
for
y
and
compris des
protection
ressortissants
of
africains,
populations,
ainsi
including
que des
African
infrastructures
nationals
civiles,
and
du personnel
civilian
médical
infrastructure,
et
medical
des
personnel,
travailleurs
and
humanitaires.
humanitarian personnel as well.
Nous réitérons l'urgence
We
d'ouvrir
reiterate the
des
urgence
corridors humanitaires
of opening up
sécurisés et
safe
appelons à
humanitarian
l'arrêt
corridors,
immédiat
and we
des
call for the
hostilités.
immediate cessation of
Sauver des vies
hostilities.
doit
Saving lives
transcender toute
must
considération
come
politique.
before any political
Les parties
consideration.
au conflit
The
doivent
parties to
saisir
the
toutes
conflict
les
must
possibilités qu'offre la
use all
diplomatie
options
pour
offered by
parvenir,
diplomacy to,
par le dialogue, à un
through
règlement
dialogue,
négocié
achieve
et
a
éviter
negotiated settlement
l'enlisement.
and
Je vous
to
remercie.
avoid a stagnation in the situation. Thank
أشكر
you.
ممثل غابون على بيانه وأعطي الكلمة
I thank the
لممثلة
representative of
كينيا.
Gabon, and I now give the floor to Kenya.
Mr. President, I thank the briefers for their presentations this afternoon. Kenya is gravely concerned that 3 weeks on, the armed conflict in Ukraine has continued unabated. The continuing reports of loss of lives and displacement and separation of loved ones, including through millions of refugees in just 3 weeks, is deeply disturbing. Kenya extends its condolences to the families who have lost loved ones to the conflicts and stands in solidarity with all the affected. We commend Ukraine's neighbors for opening their borders to refugees of multiple nationalities. And we urge them to continue ensuring that protections sought are offered with no discrimination on any basis, and particularly in regard to race or religion. Kenya condemns the targeting on and destruction of civilian objects and infrastructure, particularly residential homes, hospitals, and shelters. The parties are obliged to comply with international humanitarian law. We remind that civilians, including foreign nationals in Ukraine, are not party to the conflict and must not be a target. In this regard, all actors, including the parties, must consider to prioritize the safety and interest of civilians in accordance with international humanitarian law. The imperative to ensure that humanitarian passages are open and functioning in all times cannot be overstated. We believe that there is an urgent need for humanitarian resolution that reflects the unity and the resolve of this council to assist the people of Ukraine. Ultimately, the only way out of this crisis is an immediate and unconditional cessation of the military campaign. We urge the parties to do this to allow humanitarian assistance to flow and create room for diplomacy and constructive dialogue, including through the good offices of the UN Secretary General, towards a sustainable political solution. We underscore the need for an urgent resolution of this armed conflict. Its impact is already being felt through increased food prices, fertilizer, oil, and other essentials by multiple countries. If it is not quickly prevented, this trend, including the added effects of unilateral sanctions, will aggravate state fragilities and fuel ongoing conflicts across the world, especially in the global south. In closing, Mr. President, Kenya restates its recognition of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the political independence of Ukraine. I thank you.
أشكر ممثلة كينيا على بيانها وأعطي
I thank
الكلمة
the
لممثل
representative of
البرازيل.
Kenya, and I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you. Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank for their briefings Ms. Rosemary De Carlo, the WTO Director General Tedros Ghebreyesus, and Mr. Raouf Mazou from UNHCR. As the conflict in Ukraine lingers on, the dire humanitarian situation in the region is further deteriorating. Brazil is deeply concerned with the growing number of civilian casualties, including children, as well as the increasing flows of refugees and internally displaced people. According to some estimates, the number of people impacted by the conflict is around 18 million, of which more than 6 million are internally displaced and nearly 3 million people have fled Ukraine. The destruction of infrastructure has caused food shortages, energy outages, and intermittent communications. Under these circumstances, supply chains have been disrupted. The access to medical facilities is impaired. Medical supplies are running low, their distribution is uncertain, and some stockpiles are out of reach due to military operations. Hospitals and medical personnel are struggling to provide care to the sick and wounded. In response to the most pressing needs for humanitarian assistance, the Brazilian government has sent last week a donation encompassing water purifiers, around 9 tons of foods, and half a ton of medical items, totaling approximately 20 20,000 items donated by the Brazilian Ministry of Health. With the assistance of the Embassy of Brazil in Warsaw, the supplies were landed at that capital and delivered to Ukraine in coordination with the country's authorities. The international community must come to the assistance of the people most in need, not only those directly afflicted by the hostilities in Ukraine territory, but also refugees in the neighboring countries. We commend the World Health Organization for its work to ensure the delivery of health supplies to Ukraine and its neighboring countries. The availability of medical personnel, medicines, and health equipment is crucial to meet the urgent needs of those sick and wounded. At this moment, Ukraine's health system is under critical pressure to cope with the demands for assistance from the many victims of this conflict. It is distressing to know that as of 12 March, the World Health Organization had verified 31 attacks on healthcare facilities in Ukraine, resulting in dozens of deaths and injuries, including health workers. The attacks against healthcare are particularly worrisome since they deprive people of life-saving services. Attacks on healthcare are violations of international humanitarian law. We reiterate our position that the immediate cessation of hostilities in Ukraine is the main condition to guarantee the passage of civilians from conflagrated zones to safe areas. Moreover, only with a comprehensive and effective ceasefire, it would be allowed the rapid, safe, and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance to those in need. I thank you, Mr. President.
أشكر ممثل البرازيل على بيانه وأعطي
I
الكلمة
thank
لممثل
Brazil, and I now
الاتحاد
give the
الروسي.
floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Благодарю вас, господин
Thank you,
председатель.
Mr. President.
Мы внимательно
We
выслушали
listened
наших бриферов,
very carefully to our briefers,
разделяем
and we
озвученные
share the
озабоченности ООН
concerns
гуманитарным
voiced
кризисом,
by the
который
UN on the
гуманитарном
humanitarian
кризисе,
crisis,
который
which
разворачивается в
is
ряде регионов
unfolding in a
Украины.
number of regions in Ukraine.
На него справедливо указывают и наши коллеги
Our
по Совету
colleagues in
Безопасности.
Security Council are also rightfully pointing to it.
Однако разница в
But
том,
the
что
difference
оценки
here is that the
некоторых, в
assessments
частности,
of
западных
some, in
государств,
particular Western states, are
базируются
based
помимо ситуации с беженцами
in addition, above and
на
beyond the
раздуваемой с
situation
самого
with
начала
refugees,
российской
on
специальной
the
военной операции на
hyped
Украине
up
кампании дезинформации,
campaign
которая
of lies and
берет
disinformation
все
in
новые и новые
Ukraine is
высоты.
reaching new and new heights, and
Вот
it
и сегодня
started
мы
at the very
услышали
beginning at the
целый
special
ряд
military operation.
подобных
Today, we've
подобных
heard a whole
сообщений из уст
slew
наших коллег.
of such
Это
information from our colleagues.
это и обвинения в
The
обстреле,
accusation
ставшего уже нарицательным роддома в
the
Мариуполе,
shelling of the infamous now
и
maternity hospital in
бомбежки
Mariupol, and
мариупольских
the
театров,
shelling of the
и
Mariupol
о том, что
theater,
Россия не
and the
выпускает
fact
беженцев,
that Russia is not
и о том,
allowing
что Россия
refugees to leave,
бомбила
and that
мечеть
Russia shelled
султана Сулеймана
the
в
mosque of
Мариуполе, и о
Sultan
том, что
Suleiman in
Россия из
Mariupol,
автоматического, российские войска из автоматического
and that
оружия
Russia using
расстреляли в
automatic
очередь в
weapons
Чернигове.
to shoot
Все
a
эти
bread
фейки
line in Chernihiv.
неоднократно опровергались. Я первый
And
хочу
this
сказать
has
своей
been
американской коллеге,
refuted
когда она
many a time.
сказала, сослалась на
The
генерального директора ВОЗ,
American colleague referred to the
который
Director
якобы
General of
сказал, что
WHO, who
Россия
allegedly said
разбомбила,
that Russia,
что 33 госпиталя были
33
подвергнуты бомбардировке Россией.
hospitals were
Я
bombed
хочу
by
обратить внимание,
Russia.
что
I'd like to draw
генеральный
your
директор
attention to the
ВОЗ,
fact that the Director
спросите у
General
него,
of WHO, and please ask
этих
him,
слов не говорил.
did not say
Насколько
this.
нам известно,
As far as we know,
не в правилах ВОЗ
it is not
осуществлять
within
атрибуцию
their
о том, кто
rules to
произвел те или иные удары по
who
медицинским учреждениям.
conducted a strike
А вот
against a medical
к
facility.
вопросу об атрибуции, о
Now,
том,
on the
кого
issue of
считать виновным
attribution, who
в
is at
разрушении
fault
медицинского учреждения
when
на
it comes
Украине,
to
у нас
destroying
много вопросов.
medical facilities in Ukraine
Мы
is
еще
something
к
that
этому
we have
вернемся.
many questions about, and we'll revert to that.
Чернигове расстрел
Now, in
очереди.
Chernihiv, the
Это было
line
давно
in
уже
Chernihiv,
опровергнуто.
this
Российских
has been
военнослужащих в
refuted many a
Чернигове
time
нет.
ago. There are no
Это
Russian
все,
military
скорее
in
всего,
Chernihiv.
последствия
I
бездумной
think
раздачи оружия
this is the
кому
consequences
угодно на
of
Украине.
just distributing
Хочу
weapons
сказать,
to
что
whoever wants to
было
have
за
them
это
in
время,
Ukraine.
помимо
During
других
this
видов вооружений,
time,
было
in
роздано
addition
населению
to other kinds of
бесконтрольно
weaponry,
25 тысяч автоматического оружия.
25,000 pieces of automatic weapons had been distributed to
Мечеть,
population at large.
мечеть
Now, the mosque,
Султана Сулеймана
the
Мариуполя.
Sultan Suleiman Mosque in Mariupol,
Президент фонда мечети
the
Султана
president
Сулеймана
of the fund of the
Мариуполя
mosque of
опроверг
Sultan Suleiman Mosque
сообщение
in
о том, что турецкая
Mariupol,
мечеть с 80 мирными жителями была
refuted the fact
обстреляна
that the
российскими войсками.
Turkish mosque
Так
with
что я не знаю,
80
кто войдет в
people
книгу
was
рекордов Гиннесса по цинизму,
shelled
но я
by
точно
Russia
знаю,
from the east. So I don't
кто
know who will
войдет
end
по
up in
рекорду
the
фейков
Guinness
за одно заседание
Book
Совета
of Records, but I
Безопасности.
do know who will hold the record on
Книгу рекордов
fakes voiced during one single meeting of Security Council. That will be a Guinness Book record.
Как я уже говорил, своего
As I
рода символом,
already
работающей
said, a sort of
сейчас на полную
symbol
мощность
of
западной и украинской фабрики фейков
the fabric manufacturing fakes
стала ситуация в Мариуполе
by the
вокруг него.
Ukrainians and the
Хочу пояснить для
Westerners
тех,
are the
кто не знает,
situation
в
in
чем
Mariupol
особенность
and
этого города.
around the city. Well, let me explain to you why this place is special.
В ходе событий
In the course of events in
2014-2015 годов, когда
2014-2015,
украинская
when the
военщина бросила
Ukrainian
на
warmongers
несогласных с новой
threw
майданной
against
властью
those who were
жителей
in
востока
disagreement
страны
with the Maidan
самолеты
authorities,
и
those who
танки,
lived in the east of the country, it threw planes and tanks against them.
Мариуполь был
At the
одним из
time,
главных
Mariupol,
центров
one of the
сопротивления в
main
Донецкой
centers
Народной
of
Республике.
resistance in the Donetsk
Его
People's
жители
Republic,
почти
and
единогласно
its citizens
поддержали
almost
независимость
unanimously
республики в
supported the
ходе
independence of
референдума,
the republic during the
активно
referendum,
выступали
and they were
против
actively
националистического
speaking
режима.
out against the nationalist
Этого
regime.
украинские
And
нацисты
the
не
Ukrainian
забыли.
Nazis cannot forget that, cannot forgive that.
Утопив город в крови,
They
они
drowned the
превратили
city
его
in
в своего рода
blood, and they
штаб-квартиру
made it
и оплот
in a sort of
добровольческих нацистских
headquarters
батальонов.
and the mainstay of
Прежде всего
voluntary
Азов,
Nazi
а также
battalions,
правого
first and
сектора.
foremost, the Azov battalion and the right sector one.
В аэропорту
The
Мариуполя
Mariupol
находилась
airport
печально известная тюрьма пыточная со
had the
всей
infamous
соответствующей атрибутикой.
jail, which is also a torture center with all of the attributes
Рвами с
belonging
телами
thereof.
замученных,
It had the
карцеры и
ditches
бензопилы.
with bodies of people,
Это
solitary
не
confinement cells, and
средневековье, это
chainsaws. This is
неонацизм.
not even the Middle Ages. This is neo-Nazism.
Именно поэтому
And that is
украинские
precisely why
радикалы
the
так
Ukrainian
цепляются за этот
radicals are
город.
clinging to this
Во-первых,
city
он
so much.
скрывает
First of
множество
all, it
доказательств
covers
их
up
преступлений.
many a proof of their
А
crimes.
во-вторых, они
And
понимают,
second of
что
all,
за
they
них придется
understand that
отвечать.
they will have to be held accountable for
Поэтому
those.
поэтому они
And that's
готовы
why they
утянуть за
stand
собой в
ready
могилу
to
хоть все
drag
население Мариуполя.
into the to drag into the grave almost entire population of Mariupol.
Так же, как это делали нацисты в
Exactly the
осажденном
way it was
Берлине
done
в
by the Nazis in
1945
Berlin in
году,
1945 when it was
они
besieged.
удерживают
They
жителей в качестве
also
живого
hold
щита,
people as human
не давая
shields.
им
They do not
эвакуироваться,
allow them to
размещая рядом
evacuate, and they
с
place
живыми
right
объектами
next to
тяжелое вооружение
residential
в нарушение
buildings
норм
heavy weaponry
международного
in
гуманитарного
violation of
права.
international humanitarian law.
Этого ни наши
And this is
западные
something that
партнеры,
our
ни, к
Western
сожалению,
partners and
представители
unfortunately
секретариата
the
ООН
Secretariat
упорно не
representatives
желают
is
замечать.
something they do not
Однако
persistently
правду
do not
скрыть
want
трудно.
to
Мы
see.
отмечаем
But it's very
заявление
difficult to
НККК,
cover up facts,
высвечивающее
and here
такие
we would
факты.
like to point you to the ICRC statement, which sheds light on these facts.
В подобной обстановке
In such
неудивительно,
a
что
situation,
Мариуполь
it's
стал
not a
едва ли
surprise
не
that
лидером по
Mariupol has
числу и
become almost a
изощренности
leader on the
производство
number and
которых
ingeniousness of the
является
fakes,
одним из главных
and
занятий
their manufacturing has
украинского
become almost a
режима.
main job of the Ukrainian
Выделю
regime.
тройку
And let
самых
me just
шокирующих.
dwell on the three most
Первый
egregious
это,
of them. And the first one, of course,
безусловно,
is
бывший роддом
the
Мариуполя, якобы
former
разрушенный
maternity
российской
hospital in
ракетой.
Mariupol, allegedly destroyed by the
Не
Russian
буду
missile.
на нем
I'm
подробно
not going to dwell on this too
останавливаться.
long.
Мы уже об
Let
этом
me
говорили.
just simply say that we
Мы
covered
изложили
that
данную
earlier,
информацию в
and this
письменном виде Генерального
information is
секретаря ООН.
something that we put into a
Сложно
letter sent to
найти
the Secretary
разумное
General.
объяснение тому, что
It
наши
is very
западные коллеги
difficult to find a rational
решили не
explanation for the
только
fact that
не
our Western
замечать наше
colleagues decided
заблаговременное
not only to
предупреждение
notice a warning in
о
advance,
том,
the
что
warning
роддом
we
давно превращен
issued,
в огневую
telling
точку
everyone
украинских
that the Rodom
националистов.
had become a
Но
military firing
неоспоримые
post for the
данные о
nationalists.
постановочном
They also
характере,
ignore the
устроенном там
irrefutable
в
fact
лучших
about the
традициях белых
staged
кассах
nature
фотосессий,
of the situation there,
равно как и мнение авторитетных
along the
баллистических
lines of what
экспертов
was being done
о
by
том,
the
что
white
здание ничего не
helmets.
попадало,
And they also
а имел место подрыв.
ignoring the opinion of ballistic experts who say nothing hit the building, but rather there was an explosion there.
О втором
The
фейке мы
second
услышали в
fake
том
is
числе
something
сегодня от
that
наших
we
западных
heard
коллег.
about today also from
Россия
our Western
якобы
colleagues.
нанесла удар по
Russia
Мариупольскому
allegedly
драмтеатру,
hit the
где
Mariupol
укрывалось
theater,
более
where
1000
more
человек.
than 1,000 people had sought refuge.
На самом
In
же деле,
actual
еще
fact,
13
already on
марта
the
в
13th
широком
of
доступе
March,
частным
there was
милициям была
widely
опубликована информация,
available public
полученная
information
от жителей
provided
Мариуполя,
by private
чудом
people in
вырвавшихся из
Mariupol who
города,
managed miraculously to
что
escape the
Азов
city. They
удерживает
were
в этом
saying that
здании
Azov is holding
огромное
in that
количество
building a
людей и
huge
готовит кровавую
number of people
провокацию.
and is preparing a bloody
Не
provocation.
случайно поэтому это нас не
There,
удивляет, что
we
там было написано слово
therefore
«дети».
are not surprised by the fact that in front of the building you can see the word children
Вооруженные силы
written
России
down
были
on
информированы
soil.
о ситуации.
The Russian armed
Да и
forces were informed
изначально
about the
здание
situation,
театра не
and the
расценивалось
building
российскими
of the
войсками
theater
как цель
was
для авиабомб.
never considered as a target for a strike.
Своевременное же
But the
нахождение в местах
fact
подобных
that
провокаций
in such
западных
places, such
журналистов,
places of
рапортующих о
provocation, you
случившемся,
can very frequently find
уже
Western
становится
reporters who briskly
трагической
report
приметой
on that.
происходящих на
This is
Украине
something that's become a
провокаций,
tragic hallmark of
покрывающих
provocations
беззаконие
in
со
Ukraine,
стороны
who are covering
ВСУ
up
и
the
нацбатальонов.
excesses conducted by nationalist battalions and Ukrainian armed forces.
После того, как маховик западной
After
пропаганды разгоняет
the
по
Western
мировым СМИ
propaganda
трагическую
efforts
фотографию
to
мужчины, потерявшего
make
жену
sure that the mass
из-за
media
удара
throughout the world show a
ВСУ
picture
ракетой
of a
.у
person who had
с
lost his wife
кластерными
because
боеприпасами.
of the Ukrainian strike by .u with cluster ammunition
По центру Донецка,
against the center of Donetsk.
выдавая
And
происходящее
this is
как сцену из
presented
Киева,
as something that had taken place in Kiev.
призывать вас к какой-то объективной
After
оценке
that,
сложно.
it's very difficult for us to ask you
Еще раз
to be
напоминаю, что никто
rational in
из
your
вас,
assessment.
из
Once
западных
again,
СМИ,
let me
не сказал ни
recall
слова о
that neither
трагедии в
one
Донецке,
of you or
унесшей
Western mass
жизни
media
более
said
20 мирных жителей.
anything about the tragedy in Donetsk, which resulted in 20 deaths of
Наконец, третий
civilians.
фейк.
And the third fake. Now,
Россия якобы
Russia
насильно пытается вывести
allegedly
жителей из
is
Мариуполя и других
forcing the
украинских
people from
городов к
Mariupol
себе,
and other Ukrainian
поэтому
towns
открывать следует лишь
into Russia.
бункеры в
Therefore,
Украине.
only humanitarian corridors into
Это
Ukraine should
откровенная
be
ложь.
opened. Is a barefaced lie.
Начало сталинской
Since the
операции
beginning of
в
the special
горячую оборот
operation,
России
the
поступило
hotline of the
свыше
Ministry of
2,5
Defense of Russia
миллионов
received more
запросов
than 2.5 million requests
о эвакуации в Россию.
requests for being evacuated into Russia.
К сожалению, вынуждены
Unfortunately,
констатировать,
we
что
have
пока
to
не
state
получается
that we
эвакуировать
have
всех,
not been able
потому что
to
им
evacuate
запрещают это
everyone
делать
yet, but this is
украинские власти.
because the Ukrainian authorities are prohibiting
Но
people
только за
from doing that.
предыдущие сутки из
But
наконец
during the
разблокированного
previous
нами
24
многострадального
hours
Мариуполя
alone,
была
from the
обеспечена
finally
безопасность
end of
эвакуации
long-suffering
свыше
Mariupol,
31
we managed to
тысячи
ensure the
мирных граждан,
evacuation of more than
в
31,000
том числе
civilians,
89
including
иностранцев, среди
89 foreign
которых
nationals,
71 сотрудник
amongst whom
ОБСЕ,
71 OSCE staff,
9 граждан Греции,
9
9
Greek
граждан
nationals,
Пакистана.
and 9 Pakistani
Из
nationals.
31 тысячи
Out of the
эвакуированных, только
31,000
36
evacuees,
человек
only
перебрались
36
в
people
подконтрольную Киеву
moved to the
территорию
Kiev-controlled
Днепропетровской области.
territories in the Dnipropetrovsk
Остальные выбрали
Oblast. The
путь в Россию
rest
и
of them
населенные пункты
opted for
Запорожской и
Russia
Херсонской
and
областей
in the areas of Zaporozhye and
под
Kherson
контролем
Oblast under
вооруженных
the
сил
control
России,
of the Russian
выразив
armed
категорический
forces,
отказ
and
переезжать на
categorically
контролируемые киевскими
refused
властями
to
территории.
move over to the territories under Kiev control.
Вся гумоперация
The
проводилась
whole
силами
humanitarian
подразделений
operation
ДНР
was
и
conducted by
вооруженных
the
сил России
DNR
без
forces
какого-либо
and
участия
Russian
украинской
armed forces
стороны.
without any participation from
Обращаю
the
ваше
Ukrainian
внимание,
side.
что
I'd
сегодня
like to draw
автомобильная
your attention to
пробка
the fact
на
that
выезд из Мариуполя в
the
направлении
car
освобожденных
jam
от
at the exit
укронацистов
of
Бердянска и
Mariupol
Мелитополя
of people moving towards Berdyansk and Melitopol, freed from
составила 10
Ukrainian
километров.
Nazis, is 10 kilometers long.
Пока в город не вошли российские силы,
Until
такого мы не
Russian
наблюдали.
liberators
И это
entered the
неудивительно, ведь
city, this
мирные
is not
жители,
something
как я
that
уже
was
сказал,
seen,
нужны
and
были
this is not a
нацистам в качестве
surprise
щита.
because the peaceful civilians were needed by the Nazis as a human shield.
Те, кто спасся из
And those
Мариуполя,
who escaped
рассказывают
from
о массовых
Mariupol are telling
бесчинствах
us
и
about
преступлениях
mass
батальонов
atrocities
территориальной
and
обороны,
crimes conducted by the
издевательствах
territorial
над
defense,
стариками,
but
женщинами и
the
детьми.
abuses against the
Всем
elderly,
этим
women
людям
and children.
оказывается
And all
индивидуальная
of these
медицинская и
people are being
психологическая
individually
помощь.
provided with medical and psychological assistance.
По-разному пока складывается
The
ситуация на других
situation
направлениях.
in other areas varies.
Вчера нами в полном объеме был
Yesterday,
соблюден режим
we
тишины по
have
ранее
fully complied
предложенным
with the
украинской
quiet
стороне
guns
гуманитарным
regimes
коридорам
along
на
the
Киевском,
humanitarian corridors
Запорожском,
proposed the
Житомирском,
Ukrainian side
Сумском,
and the Kiev,
Харьковском и
Zaporozhye,
Полтавском
Zhytomyr,
направлениях.
Sumsk, Kharkovsk, and Poltav directions.
Это
And
неоднократно
this
подтверждено
has
средствами
been many
объективного
times
контроля, в том числе
confirmed
с
by the means
использованием
of objective
беспилотных
control,
летательных аппаратов.
including with the use of drones.
По of По открытым в
On
сторону
the
России гуманитарным
humanitarian
коридорам
corridors open
неонацисты
towards
никого не
Russia,
выпускали, угрожая физически
neo-Nazis were not
расправой.
allowing
кому
people to
удавалось
go. They
прорваться,
threatened
безжалостно
them,
обстреливали.
and those who managed to break through were being shot at.
Вчера на Харьковском
Yesterday,
направлении
in
в
the
очередной
Kharkov
раз под
direction,
обстрел
once
попала
again,
автобусная
there
колонна с
was a
беженцами,
column of buses full of
двигавшимися по гуманитарному
refugees. They're moving
коридору в
along the
сторону России.
humanitarian corridor towards
В
Russia. It
результате
was
4
being
человека
shelled.
погибли,
As
есть
a
раненые.
result, 4 people died and they're injured.
Однако, несмотря на все
But
трудности и
despite all of the
препятствия, только за
difficulties and all
прошлые
of the
сутки, без
impediments,
участия Киева,
during
из
yesterday
опасных
alone,
районов нам
without the
удалось
participation of
эвакуировать
Kiev, we managed to
12
evacuate from
440
dangerous areas
человек, из них
12,440 people,
2242 ребенка.
out of them 2,242 children.
Всего с начала специальной военной
Overall,
операции
since the beginning of special
271
military operation,
231
already
человек, из которых
271,000 people,
58
out of them
это дети,
58,000 children have been evacuated.
пересекли границу России,
They have crossed the border of Russia.
включая 31 тысячу
This
единиц
includes
личного автотранспорта.
31,000 individual cars.
Мы готовы принять и
And we
больше
stand
людей.
ready to
Субъекты
take even
Российской
more.
Федерации
In
продолжают
subjects of Russian
функционировать свыше
Federation, we have more than
9,5 тысяч
9.5
пунктов временного
thousand
размещения.
points of temporary housing.
На освобожденных же территориях нам
In
создаются
the
все
liberated
необходимые условия для
territories, we
беспрепятственного
create
доступа
all of
желающих
the
к
conditions to make
гуманитарной
sure that
помощи,
those who
которая
want to can
в ряде
accede
мест
to the
фактически
humanitarian
остается единственной
assistance,
возможностью выжить.
humanitarian assistance, which remains in many places the only possible means of survival.
При этом медикаменты,
The
одежда и
medicines,
продовольствие,
clothes,
поступающие
and
от
food
международных
which are
организаций, в
received from
частности,
international organizations,
от
in
МККК,
particular from
мэры украинских
ICRC,
городов
is something
перепродают
that the
местным
mayors
предпринимателям.
of Ukrainian cities resell to local
Такие факты нам
entrepreneurs.
достоверно
These
установлены в городах
facts have been
Житомир,
reliably
Ивано-Франковск,
established in
Винница,
Zhytomyr, in
Ровно,
Ivano-Frankivsk,
Луцк,
in Vinnytsia, in Rovno,
Дубна,
in Lutsk, in Dubna,
Владимир-Волынск и
in
Львов.
Vladimir Volensky, and in Lvov.
В заложниках, по сути, в заложниках у
Hostages,
батальонов
basically
территориальной
hostage
обороны
of the
продолжают
territorial
оставаться
defense
6910
battalions
иностранных граждан
are
из 22 государств,
6,910 of foreign nationals from
а
22
также
states.
экипажи 70 иностранных
Also,
судов
crews of
в
70 foreign
заблокированных
ships
морских
are
портах Украины в
blocked
связи с
in the
высокой
seaports
минной
of Ukraine
опасностью,
because there is a very high
созданной
danger of
киевскими
mines. And
властями
this
в
was
своих
created by
внутренних
Kievan
водах
authorities
и
in their
территориальном море,
internal
а
waters
также
and
в связи с
territorial
возможными
sea.
провокациями
And this
ВСУ со
also
стороны
is
берега.
related to the possible provocations by the Ukrainian armed
Мы
forces from the
продолжаем
shore.
осуществлять поставки
We
гумпомощи
continue
нуждающимся жителям
sending
Украины.
humanitarian assistance to the needy in Ukraine.
Только в Мариуполе
And
нами было
Mariupol
доставлено уже
alone
более
received more than
450 тонн продуктов
450
питания,
tons of
медикаментов и
food,
предметов первой
medicines, and
необходимости.
basic necessities.
Всего же со 2 марта
Overall,
силами
starting
МЧС и
with
Минобороны
the
России
2nd of March,
в
our
отдельные районы
emergency
Украины,
services and the
включая
Ministry of
Донбасс,
Defense
в общей
supplied
сложности уже
to
доставлено без
various
малого
regions
3000
of
тонн
Ukraine, including
гуманитарной груза,
Donbass,
а также
supplied
стройматериалов.
about 3,000 tons of humanitarian
Другой
cargo,
вопрос в том, что
including
в ряде
construction
случаев местная
materials.
администрация
Another issue here is that
просто-напросто
in a
угрожает расправой
number
за
of
получение
cases, the
российской
local
гуманитарной помощи.
administrations are threatening punishment to those who
На
receive
этом фоне почти
Russian
каждый день
humanitarian
мы видим
assistance. And
сообщения из
against
западных
this,
столиц о новых
basically
поставках
every
Киева
day
очередных
we
партий всевозможных
see
вооружений.
information from Western capitals that they are providing Kiev with yet another cargo of all kinds of weaponry.
Только вчера Вашингтон объявил,
Yesterday,
что уже на этой
Washington
неделе
announced
передаст
that this
Украине
week
оборонную помощь на
Ukraine
$1
will
миллиард
receive
долларов.
from them defense assistance to the amount of $1 billion.
Вы подливаете бензин в
You
этот
are
конфликт.
fueling this conflict, pouring
Уже
oil
сейчас
into it.
очевидно,
It is
какой
already
трагедии
clear now
привела
what
бесконтрольная
kind of
раздача простого легкого
tragedy
оружия
resulted from
всем
simply
желающим.
distributing light weapons to anyone who
А
wanted
знают
them
ли
without any
западные
control. I
избиратели и
wonder
налогоплательщики о рисках
whether the
попадания этого
Western
вооружения,
taxpayers
включая
know
ПЗРК,
about the
к группам в
risks
Европе?
of this weaponry ending
Да
up
и в целом, осознаете ли вы,
with the terrorist groups in Europe,
да и в
portable air
целом
defense weapons,
осознаете
for
ли вы
example.
опасность
Do you
подогревания ситуации в
understand
Украине
how
для собственной
dangerous it
безопасности?
is to fuel the
Все
situation in
читали
Ukraine,
новости
how
про упавший на
dangerous it
территории
is for your
Хорватии,
own security?
начиненные
Everyone
из
has
десятка
heard
беспилотников, прилетевших
about
с
the
территории
drone which
Украины.
landed
Слово сказать, он остался
Croatia.
незамеченным,
It
хотя пролетел
it
над несколькими странами.
had
При
it was
этом от
full
самой
of
западной точки
explosives.
Украины до Загреба свыше 700
It
километров.
was not noticed, even though it crossed over several countries from the western point in Ukraine to Zagreb. That's more than 700 kilometers.
Господин председатель, к сожалению,
Mr.
констатирую,
President,
что Украина,
we note with
как
regret,
была для наших западных коллег
Ukraine
пешкой
has always was
геополитической
a
борьбе против
pawn
России,
in the
так и
geopolitical
осталось.
struggle against Russia and remains such a
Западным
pawn still.
политикам было
Western
наплевать на то, как
politicians
все эти
couldn't
годы
care
от украинских
less
обстрелов страдали, погибали
about
Донбасс,
the
включая
suffering of the
женщин и
people in
стариков.
Donbass, including women, children, and the elderly.
Если бы это было не так,
If
мы бы
this were
сейчас
not the case,
не сталкивались с
we
неприглядной вознёй
would not be now dealing with a salacious uproar
вокруг проекта гуманитарной резолюции Совета Безопасности
surrounding
Украины.
the draft of
После
humanitarian
того, как
resolutions
ее
on
текст
Ukraine.
разработали Франция и
After
Мексика,
its draft was
он сразу же
developed by
перестал быть
France and Mexico, it
гуманитарным
stopped
и
being
наполнился
humanitarian
политическими
immediately
формулировками,
and became full of
не
political
имеющими
formulas
никакого
which
отношения к
have
гуманитарному
nothing to
вопросу.
do with humanitarian
Без
issues.
этого, как нам было четко сказано,
As we were
западным странам
clearly
проект не
told,
нужен.
the Western countries didn't need this project
С тем,
without
чтобы
them at
получить
all.
антироссийский
In
продукт, они
order
готовы
to end up
продвигать
with an
его не в
anti-Russian
Совете
product,
Безопасности,
they
а
are
в
ready to
Генассамблее,
push it forward, not
игнорируя
in the
то, что
Security
такой
Council,
документ
but in the General
гуманитарщикам
Assembly,
ничего не
ignoring the
даст.
fact that this kind of document will help humanitarians nothing.
Поэтому Россия внесла
And
в
that is
Совет свой
why
проект,
Russia
содержащий все то, что
put
нужно
forward its
гуманитарщикам.
own draft containing within it
Там
everything
нет
that the
только политических
humanitarians
оценок,
need. It
которых
does
вы не
not contain
найдете в других
political assessments.
гуманитарных
And
резолюциях
this is
Совета.
not the kind of assessment that you can find in other
Вы открыли
humanitarian
документ для
resolutions
коспонсорства
either.
всех
And we opened this
членов
document
ООН.
for the co-sponsorship by all UN members.
Однако нам говорят,
But
что
we are being told
гуманитарная
that
резолюция,
the
представленная
humanitarian
Россией,
resolution submitted by Russia
западные страны не устраивают.
is not something that satisfies Western countries.
Это выдает истинные
And
цели
this shows the
наших
true goal
спонсоров первой гуманитарной,
of
так называемой
the
гуманитарной резолюции
sponsors of
Совета.
the first
И это
so-called
как раз
humanitarian
является
resolution
настоящим
council.
лицемерием и
And that is
цинизмом.
true hypocrisy here.
Еще одним цинизмом является то,
And
что на
cynicism,
нас
another
выходят коллеги
point of
из многих
cynicism
делегаций и
is that
жалуются
many
на
colleagues from many
беспощадное давление
delegations
и
tell
выкручивание рук
us about
со стороны
unprecedented
западных партнеров,
pressure
вплоть
by
до
Western
экономического
partners
шантажа и
that their
угроз.
arms are being twisted, including blackmail and threats.
Соединенные Штаты и
The
Албания
United States
распространили
and
письмо,
Albania has disseminated a letter
в котором
in
члены ООН призывают
which
не
members of
спонсировать
the
нашу резолюцию.
UN are appealed to refrain from sponsoring our
Мы
resolution.
понимаем,
We do
как этим странам
understand
не просто
how
противостоять этому натиску.
difficult it is for those countries to
По
withstand this kind of
по
onslaught.
этой причине мы
And
приняли решение
therefore,
пока
we
не
decided
запрашивать
to,
голосование
at
по
this
нашему
stage, not
проекту,
to ask for a
но
vote
проект
on our
резолюции
draft,
мы не
but
отзываем.
we are not withdrawing the draft
А
resolution.
вместо этого завтра
Instead,
утром мы
tomorrow
запросим
morning, we
срочное
will ask for an
заседание, чтобы
emergency
обсудить,
meeting
вновь
to
обсудить тему
discuss again the
биолаборатории США
issue
на
of US
Украине,
biolaboratories
с
in
учетом
Ukraine
новых
using the
документов,
new
попавших
documents
нам в
we
распоряжение в ходе
obtained in the
специальной
course
военной
of the
операции.
special military operation.
Прямо сейчас
And right now,
направим
we
соответствующее
are
письмо
going to
Эмиратскому
forward the letter
председательству.
on that
Благодарю
to
вас.
the Emirati presidency. I thank you.
أشكر ممثل الاتحاد الروسي على بيانه وأعطي الكلمة لممثل الصين.
谢谢主席先
Thank you,
生。
Mr. President.
主席先生，
Mr. President,
我感谢迪卡洛
I
总秘
thank
书长、
USG DiCarlo,
谭德赛总干事
Director
和
General
马祖助
Gabriel
理高专
and Assistant High Commissioner
刚才所
Mazu
做的通报。
for their briefings just
中
made.
方对乌克兰人道局势的不断恶
China
化
is
深表
deeply
担
worried
忧，
about the
对有
worsening
关平民
humanitarian
伤亡
situation in
增加、
Ukraine and
难民人
deplores 增
数
the
增加的
reported
报道
increase in
感到
civilian
痛心。
casualties and refugees.
当务之急是要呼
The
吁各方
pressing task
保持
now
最大
is
的
to call
克
for
制，
maximum
保
restraint
障
from
妇女、
all
儿
parties
童在
and
内
to
的所
ensure
有平
safety
民
and
安
security
全
of all civilians,
和
including
基
women
本
and
人道
children,
需求，
and meeting their basic
防止发
humanitarian
生更
needs
大规
so
模
as to
的
prevent
人
the
道危
occurrence
机。
of a larger
中
scale
方支持有
humanitarian
关当事
crisis.
方保持
China
沟通，
supports the work
确
by the
保人
relevant
道走
parties
廊
in
安
maintaining
全畅通，
communication,
继
ensuring
续
safe
为
and
人员
unimpeded
撤离
humanitarian
为人
corridor,
道救
and
援
further
提供便利。
facilitating personnel evacuation and
当前冲
humanitarian
突造成
assistance.
的难民和流离失所
The
者人
number
数
of
仍
refugees
在
and displaced
增加，
persons caused by the conflict
对
is
乌克
still
兰
on
和
the
周边
rise,
国家
bringing
造成
huge
巨
impact
大的
on
冲突。
Ukraine and the surrounding
中方
countries.
支持联合国
China
人道协调
supports
办公室、联合
OCHA,
国难民署、世
UNHCR,
卫组织等
and
机构
WHO,
积
among
极开
others,
展行
in
动，
actively conducting
动员国
operations
际社
and
会向
mobilizing
所
the
有
international
需要的
community
人
to assist
提供救
all
援。
those in need.
前段时间，
In the recent
一
past,
些非洲裔、
some
中
people
东裔
of
人
African
员
or Middle
在
East
撤离过
descent
程中
encountered difficulties during
应当引起
evacuation.
重视，
This
并予
should be
以妥
taken
善解决。
seriously and addressed
所有
properly.
难民，
All
无论
refugees,
肤色、
regardless
种
of
族、
color, race, or
宗教信
religion,
仰，根据国际难
shall
民
be
法，
accorded
都应
the
获
necessary
得必要
protection
的保护。
under international refugee law.
中方高度重视乌克
China
兰人道
pays
局
high
势，
attention to the
提出
humanitarian
了
situation
6 点
in
倡议
Ukraine
主张
and。 has put forward a 6-point
中国红十
proposal.
字会
The Red Cross
已经向
Society
乌
of
克兰提
China
供
has
3批
provided Ukraine
援
with
助物
3
资，
batches of
其中
humanitarian supplies,
第3批物
with
资
the
包
third
括
one
儿童奶粉
containing
和棉被等，
milk powder and
重
quilts
点
for
帮助乌
children,
克兰红十字
specifically
会
helping
救
the Red
助
Cross
受
Society
冲突
of
影响
Ukraine
的流离
assist
失所儿
displaced
童。
children affected by the
我们
conflict.
欢迎各方提
We
出的
welcome
任何有
any
助于缓
initiative
解
or
和
proposal
解
from
决
any
乌克兰
party
人道危
that
机的倡
contributes
议
to
和举措。
alleviating and resolving the
安
humanitarian
理会
crisis
肩
in
负负
Ukraine.
责国际
The
维护
Security
国际和
Council
平与
bears the
安全
primary
的
responsibility
首
for
要责任，
maintaining international peace and
应当为
security
缓解
and
乌
should
克兰人
therefore
道局
play
势
a
发
positive
挥
role
积极
in
作用。
easing the humanitarian
中方
situation
期
in
待安理
Ukraine.
会
China
能
hopes
在人道
that
问
the
题上
Council
保持
can
团
stay
结，
united on the
体现
humanitarian
建
issue
设性态度。
and demonstrate a constructive
实际先生，
attitude. Mr. President,
国际社会普遍希望
the
尽快实
international
现停火，
community shares the common
缓解
aspiration
现地
for
局势，
ceasefire at an
避
early
免
date
平民
to
伤亡，
alleviate the situation
这
on the
也
ground
是
and to
中方
prevent
的期
civilian
待。
casualties. This is also the
目
aspiration
前，
of China.
俄罗斯
To
和乌克
date,
兰已经举
Russia
行
and
了
Ukraine
4轮
have
谈
held
判，
4 rounds of
能
negotiations.
够保持谈判，
Keeping the
就有
negotiations
实现
going
停火的
means
希望，
there is a
就
chance
能
for
开辟
ceasefire
和平的未
and
来。
that there is a chance for a
中方
peaceful
将继
future.
续劝和
China
促谈，
remains committed to
我们
promoting
支
peace
持联合
through
国
negotiations.
和各
We
方
support
大
the
力开
UN and the
展
parties
斡旋
concerned
努力，
in vigorously carrying out
也
good
希望各
offices.
方
We
都
also
能够
hope
多做
that all
有
parties
利
will
于
do
劝和
more
促谈
to facilitate
而
peace
不是
talks
火上浇油的事
and
情。
not to
实践证明，
add fuel to fire.
一味依靠
Facts
制裁
have
解决不了
proven
问题，
that wanton use of
还会
sanctions
制
will
造
not
出
solve any
新的问
problem,
题。
but will instead create
在
new
全球
problems.
经济复苏乏
Given the
力的情
sluggish
况下，
recovery in global
无限
economy,
制的制裁
ever
正
escalating
在破
sanctions
坏国
are
际产业链、
undermining
供应
stability
链
in
稳定，
international industrial chain
加
and
剧
supply
粮
chain,
食、能
thus
源危机，
exacerbating food and
伤
energy
及各国，
crises,
特
damaging
别是
people's
发展
livelihood
中
in
国
all
家的
countries, developing
民生，
countries in particular,
引发
and
新的人
triggering
道后果。
new humanitarian
这也是安
consequences.
理会
This is
在
also
处理
an
乌克
issue
兰
that the
人道
Security
问题
Council shall pay attention
是
to
应该
when
重视的问
addressing
题。
the
谢
humanitarian
谢你，主
situation
席
in
先生。
Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. President.
أشكر ممثل الصين على بيانه وأعطي الكلمة لممثل المكسيك.
Muchas gracias,
Thank you very much,
señor
Mr.
presidente.
President.
Agradezco a la
I
secretaria
thank
general adjunta,
Undersecretary
Rosemary Di
General
Carlo,
Rosemary
al
DiCarlo,
subcomisionado para operaciones de la
the
ACNUR, el
Assistant
señor
High
Masud, y
Commissioner
al
for
director
Operations at
general de la
UNHCR, Mr.
Organización
Mazou, and the
Mundial de la
Director
Salud,
General of the World
el
Health
doctor
Organization,
Ghebreyesus, por
Dr.
sus
Ghebreyesus,
presentaciones.
for their briefings.
Han transcurrido
It has been
3
3
semanas
weeks now
desde el inicio de
since
la
the
invasión
beginning
rusa a
of the
Ucrania
Russian invasion
y el saldo
of
es
Ukraine,
realmente
and the
devastador.
toll is truly a devastating
Hemos
one.
escuchado cifras
We have heard
trágicas,
tragic
más de
figures,
3 millones de
more than
refugiados
3 million
y cerca
refugees
de
and almost
1.8 millones de
1.8
desplazados
million internally
internos.
displaced.
Son números
These are
exorbitantes,
exorbitant numbers,
sobre todo si recordamos que
especially if
hace
we remember
exactamente un
that
mes
almost exactly
estábamos
a month
en
ago,
esta
we
misma
were
sala
sitting in this
evaluando la
same room,
implementación
evaluating
de
the
los acuerdos de
implementation of the
Minsk.
Minsk agreements,
Y en esa sesión, por cierto, se nos dijo
during which, and I
que
should
lo que
mention,
ocurría
we
en
were
el
told that
terreno
what was taking
eran
place on the ground
solamente
was
ejercicios
merely
militares.
military exercises.
¿Cuál es entonces la
So,
perspectiva
what is the
humanitaria
humanitarian
si
outlook
continúa el
if
patrón
the current
que ha imperado
pattern
hasta ahora?
continues?
Quiero empezar por
I
reconocer
wish to
la
begin by
disposición solidaria
acknowledging the
de todos los
solidarity
países
extended
que
by
han
all those
recibido
countries that
refugiados,
have received refugees,
especialmente
especially
aquellos
those
quienes han
that
asumido
have
el influjo
received
más numeroso.
the largest numbers
Pero
of
las necesidades de las
refugees.
personas
But the needs of those
que no han
persons
podido
that
salir
were
o
unable
no han
to
logrado
leave
ser
or
evacuadas
were
de
unable
las
to be
áreas
evacuated
urbanas
from
acosadas
the urban
han
areas under siege
aumentado, han
has
aumentado
have
y
increased
seguirán
and
creciendo.
will continue to
especialmente
increase,
aquellas que no
especially
tienen acceso
the needs of
a
those who do
servicios
not
básicos,
have access to basic
agua potable,
services, safe drinking water,
alimentos o medicina.
foods, and medicines.
Resulta pues imperativo
There is therefore an
garantizar el
urgent need
acceso
to
seguro e
ensure
irrestricto
safe and
del personal
unimpeded
humanitario,
access
del
for
personal de salud,
humanitarian personnel
son los
and
únicos que
medical
pueden
personnel
brindar
who
esos
are the
servicios
only ones
básicos a
that
la
can
población
provide these
civil.
basic services to the civilian
Señor
population.
Presidente, como
Mr.
hemos
President,
escuchado,
as we have heard,
la Organización Mundial de
the
la Salud
World Health
ha registrado
Organization's
43 ataques a
organization has
instalaciones
recorded
médicas en
43
Ucrania.
attacks on medical
Y el
installations in
hecho
Ukraine. And the fact that
incontrovertible
the
es que atacar
uncontestable fact is
instalaciones
that
sanitarias
attacking
está
health installations is
expresamente prohibido
expressly
por el derecho
prohibited under
internacional
international
humanitario.
humanitarian law.
Urge entonces
There's
garantizar
therefore
que se
an
respeten
urgent
las
need
más
for
de
guarantees
300
that the over
instalaciones médicas
300 medical
que se encuentran a
facilities
lo largo de las
found
líneas del
along the
conflicto
lines of the
o
conflict
dentro
or
de ellas.
behind the lines of the conflict
Deploramos
will
también
not be
los
attacked.
ataques contra el personal de
We
salud,
condemn the attacks
así
against
como de sus
medical
medios de
personnel
transporte
as well as
o del equipo
their
que requieren
vehicles
para poder
or the
operar.
equipment they need to
Las
do their work.
consecuencias a corto
The
y a largo
long-term
plazo
and
de estas
short and
acciones sobre
long-term
la
impact
población
of these
civil
attacks
y en
against
contra de
civilian
los sistemas de
populations and
salud
against health
pueden
facilities
en efecto ser
can
irreversibles
indeed be
y por eso
irreversible,
mismo
and for that
son
very reason
inadmisibles.
they are
Reiteramos
unacceptable.
nuestro llamado a
We
cumplir con
reiterate
las
our call
resoluciones del Consejo
for
de Seguridad en
compliance
la
with
materia,
Security Council
la
resolutions dealing with this issue,
2286,
and that would
que
be
incluye
Resolution
menciones
2286, which
específicas a la
includes
protección del
specific
personal
mentions of
sanitario y
protection
humanitario,
for medical and
y la
humanitarian personnel,
2573,
and Resolution
que se refiere a los
2573,
bienes
which
civiles
refers to
considerados
civilian property
como
considered
indispensables.
as essential.
En el mismo
In
sentido,
the same vein,
encontramos la decisión emitida ayer
we
por
saw
la Corte
the
Internacional de
decision handed down
Justicia,
yesterday by the
en la
International
que
Court
se
of
ordena
Justice,
la suspensión
ordering the
inmediata de las
immediate
operaciones
suspension
militares
of military
que
operations,
comenzaron el
which began
pasado
on
24
the
de febrero.
24th of February.
Como lo hemos
As we
reiterado
have
ante
stated
este
time
Consejo,
and again
la
in this
premisa
council, the
fundamental para la
fundamental
asistencia
premise
humanitaria
for humanitarian
es el
assistance
cese
is
de las
the
hostilidades.
cessation of
Señor
hostilities.
Presidente,
Mr. President,
en tanto que las Naciones
while the
Unidas
United
y
Nations and
diversos
other
actores
humanitarian
humanitarios
actors
concentran sus esfuerzos
focus their
en
efforts
proveer la ayuda
on
urgente que la
providing the
población
urgent need,
necesita,
assistance
es
needed by
oportuno reiterar
the
también que la
people.
única
Now
solución
is
a
the
este
time as well
conflicto
to reiterate that the
será por
only
la vía
solution
del
to this
diálogo
conflict
y de
is
la
through
diplomacia.
dialogue and diplomacy.
Reconocemos las
We
iniciativas
recognize the
en curso,
initiatives underway,
incluyendo el
including the
reciente
recent
encuentro en el
meeting
marco del
within the
foro
framework
de
of the
Antalya.
Antalya
Cualquier
Forum.
intento
Any
genuino de
genuine
negociación
attempt
debe
at
ser
negotiations
bienvenido.
can only be welcome.
Por ello lamentamos
For this reason,
que a
we
pesar
note
de
with regret
nuestros
that
esfuerzos
despite our genuine
genuinos
good faith
de buena
efforts,
fe en los que hemos estado
in which we have
activos
been
en estas
engaged
dos últimas
these
semanas
past 2
junto con
weeks,
Francia
along with France
y otros
and
estados
other member states,
cuya participación constructiva mucho
whose
agradecemos,
constructive
no haya
participation we're
sido
very grateful
posible
for.
aún
This
que
council
este Consejo
is as
haga
yet
un llamado
unable to
inequívoco
issue an
al
unequivocal
cese
call
de las
for an
hostilidades.
end to the hostilities.
Un llamado
Such
en
a
este
call
sentido
from
por
this
parte del
council
Consejo sería
would
el
be
mayor apoyo
the
humanitario
most
que pudiera recibir la
significant
población civil
humanitarian
en Ucrania.
support that the
Muchas
civilian
gracias.
population in Ukraine could receive. Thank you very much.
أشكر ممثل المكسيك على بيانه.
I thank the representative of Mexico for
أجي
his
الآن
statement.
ببيان
I shall now
بصفتي
make a
ممثل
statement
الإمارات العربية
as
المتحدة.
in my capacity as a representative of the United
أشكر
Arab
كل
Emirates.
من السيدة روزماري
I would
ديكارلو
like to thank Ms.
والسيد
Rosemary
رؤوف
DiCarlo,
مازو
Mr.
والدكتور
Rauf Mazu,
تدروس
and
جبريسوس
Dr.
على
Tedros Ghebreyesus
إحاطاتهم
for their
الوفية.
valuable briefings.
ما استمعنا إليه
What
اليوم
we have heard today
يعكس التدهور
reflects
الخطير
the serious
للأوضاع
deterioration
الإنسانية
of the
جراء
humanitarian
استمرار
situation
الصراع
as a
في
result
أوكرانيا،
of the conflict in
حيث
Ukraine.
تواصل أعداد اللاجئين
The number
الارتفاع
of refugees
بوتيرة
is
مثيرة للقلق.
increasing add
كما
an
تستمر
alarming
معاناة
rate.
المدنيين في
Civilians
المناطق الأوكرانية
throughout Ukraine
بسبب
continue to
العراقيل
suffer
أمام وصول
due to the
المساعدات
obstacles
الإنسانية
hindering the
مثل
delivery of
الغذاء
humanitarian assistance,
والمعدات
such
الطبية
as food,
وغيرها
medical
من
equipment,
الاحتياجات الأساسية.
and other basic needs.
وفي الوقت نفسه
At the same time,
فإن الضرر الذي لحق
damage to
بالبنية
civilian
التحتية المدنية
infrastructure
سيفاقم من
continues
تردي
to
الوضع
worsen
الإنساني
the
في المدن
humanitarian
الأوكرانية
situation
الرئيسية
in major
لا
Ukrainian
سيما
cities
ماريوبول.
such as
وفي
Mariupol.
هذا الإطار
In this
تود
context,
بلادي
my
التركيز
country
على
would
4
like to
نقاط
focus
رئيسية.
on 4 main points.
أولاً
First,
أننا ننظر بإيجابية تجاه المفاوضات الجارية
we remain
بين
hopeful
الاتحاد
about the
الروسي
ongoing
وأوكرانيا،
negotiations between the
ونأمل
Russian Federation
أن
and Ukraine.
تسفر عن
We hope
تهدئة
that these
تسمح
negotiations will
للمنظمات
pave the way
الإنسانية
for
بأن
calm
تقوم
to allow
بمهامها
humanitarian
وأن تلبي
organizations to carry
احتياجات
out their
المدنيين.
role and meet the
وفي هذا
needs of
السياق
civilians.
هناك ضرورة ملحة
There is an urgent
لاتخاذ
need
خطوات
to
ملموسة
take concrete
تهدف
steps
لتهدئة
aimed at
الأوضاع
de-escalating
على
the
الأرض
situation on the
وبناء
ground
الثقة
and
بين
building
الطرفين،
trust between the
بما
parties.
في ذلك عبر التوصل لاتفاقات تمكن
To
المنظمات
enable
الإنسانية
humanitarian
من إيصال
organizations to
المساعدات
deliver aid
للمحتاجين
safely
بطريقة آمنة،
to those in need
وإنشاء ممرات
and allow
لخروج المدنيين،
safe and unhindered
والتوصل
passage
لتفاهم
for
يضمن
civilians
حمايتهم.
fleeing the conflict
ثانياً
and ensuring
تثمن
their
بلادي
protection.
الدور الرئيسي لدول الجوار،
Second, my country appreciates
وبالأخص
the critical
بولندا
role of neighboring
ورومانيا
countries,
ومولدوفا،
especially Poland,
بالإضافة
Romania,
لغيرها
and
من الدول
Moldova,
في
as well
التعامل
as other
مع
countries,
الأزمة
in
الإنسانية من
responding to
خلال
the humanitarian
استقبالها
crisis by receiving
للاجئين
refugees
وتوسيع شبكة
and expanding
الأمان
social
الاجتماعي
safety networks
لتراعي احتياجاتهم.
to meet their needs.
وفي الوقت نفسه
At the same time,
ندرك من تجارب منطقة الشرق الأوسط
and
أهمية
drawing
دعم
from
هذه
our
الدول
experiences in the Middle East, we
لتتمكن من
recognize the
رعاية
need to support
اللاجئين
these countries
بشكل كامل، خصوصا وأن الصراع ما زال
in
قائم
order to provide
مما
care
ينذر
to refugees,
باستمرار
especially
موجات
as the
اللاجئين.
continuation of the current conflict
ثالثا
entails continued waves of
وبالتزامن
displacement.
مع
Third,
جولات التفاوض الجارية
in parallel to the
تشدد
ongoing
بلادي
rounds of
على أهمية
negotiations, my
الالتزام
country
بالقانون
stresses the
الدولي
importance of adhering to international
وبالأخص
law, in
القانون الإنساني
particular
الدولي،
international
والذي
humanitarian law.
يمثل خرقه ليس فقط
Violating
انتهاكا لحقوق
international law
المدنيين
not only
بل
represents a threat
تهديدا
to the rights
للنظام
of
الدولي.
civilians, but also
ونكرر
a
هنا
threat to the
دعوتنا
entire
لجميع
international
الأطراف
order. In
المعنية
this regard,
إلى
we
احترام
reiterate our call for
التزاماتها
all concerned
الدولية
parties to
ووقف
respect their
استهداف
international obligations
المدنيين
and to stop
والبنية
targeting
التحتية
civilians
المدنية.
and civilian infrastructure.
وأخيرا
In conclusion,
تؤمن دولة الإمارات
the
بضرورة
UAE
أن
believes
تركز
that
استجابة
the
مجلس الأمن
Council's response
للأزمة الإنسانية
to the humanitarian crisis
الناتجة عن الصراع في
resulting
أوكرانيا
from the conflict
على
in
العمل
Ukraine should
الإنساني
focus
بطريقة
on humanitarian
عملية
action
وهادفة،
in a concrete and
وذلك
productive manner
بالتنسيق مع مكتب
in
تنسيق
coordination
الشؤون
with
الإنسانية
OCHA
والجهات الإنسانية
and
الأخرى
other relevant
ذات الصلة.
humanitarian actors.
ونؤكد بأن
We
الحل الوحيد
reaffirm
للأزمة
that
يكمن
a
في
solution
تكثيف
to the crisis
الجهود
can only be
الدبلوماسية
achieved through
والوقف
intensifying
الفوري
diplomatic
للأعمال
efforts,
العدائية
immediately
في
ceasing
جميع
hostilities
أنحاء
throughout
أوكرانيا
Ukraine,
والسعي إلى
and
سلام
seeking a
مستدام
sustainable peace
يحفظ
that
استقلال وسيادة
preserves
أوكرانيا
Ukraine's
وسلامة
independence,
أراضيها
sovereignty,
ويعزز الأمن
and
والاستقرار
territorial
في
integrity, in
المنطقة
addition to
والعالم.
enhancing regional and international security and stability.
أستأنف مهامي
I
كرئيس
now resume my
للمجلس.
functions as President of the Council.
طلبت ممثلة الولايات
The
المتحدة
representative of the
الكلمة
United
لإدلاء
States has
ببيان
asked for the
آخر.
floor to
أعطي لها
give an
الكلمة.
additional intervention. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I was momentarily pleased to hear that the Russians were pulling down the vote on their farcical humanitarian resolution, which was doomed to fail. We know if Russia really truly cared about humanitarian crises, the one that it created, it could simply stop its attacks on the people of Ukraine. But instead, they want to call for another Security Council meeting to use this council as a venue for its disinformation and for promoting its propaganda. Let us not forget that Russia is the aggressor here. They are the ones that are creating a pretext for attacks on their own people, and we can't be fooled by their efforts here. They have troops inside of Ukraine. They are killing people inside of Ukraine. That is the reason for us being here today, not to deal with their propaganda. Thank you.
أشكر ممثلة الولايات المتحدة على
I thank the
بيانها.
representative of the United States for
أعطي الكلمة
her
الآن
statement. I now
لممثل
give the
أوكرانيا.
floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Madam Undersecretary General Di Carlo, Director General, Assistant High Commissioner. I also recognize the representative of the aggressor state present here in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. Let me begin with a quote. The operation is developing successfully and in strict accordance with plans that have been previously approved. End of quote. Said by Putin yesterday, 3 weeks after the unprovoked and unjustified Russian invasion of Ukraine started. Over these weeks, the international community was wrestled with the question, why? Why has the Russian Federation decided to cosplay the Nazi Third Reich by attacking the peaceful neighboring state and plunging the region into war? What are the reasons and what is the plan? And yesterday we got the answer. Killing Ukrainian children, 108 innocent souls so far. Let me quote again. Success in the strict accordance with the plans approved previously, according to Putin. Children are deliberate target, given yesterday's bombardment of the Mariupol Drama Theater, a shelter for hundreds of local residents, mostly women and children. Despite the big signs, children painted on the road on both sides of the building being clearly visible, Russian pilots dropped an aerial bomb. The building was fully damaged, but the shelter fortunately withstood. It did not turn into one of more mass graves, as Putin's plan probably envisaged, previously approved. Of course, Putin's plan does not limit murders to children only. All civilian Ukrainians and foreign citizens are under threat. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights recorded 726 confirmed cases of killing of civilians, while believing that the real figures are considerably higher. And they are indeed. Just yesterday in the city of Chernihiv, 53 civilian residents were killed by Russian bombs and shells. On the same day, in Merefa, Kharkiv region, 21 people were killed following Russian shelling that destroyed the local school and residential buildings. The plan is also to raze Ukrainian cities to the ground: Kharkiv, Sumy, Volnovakha, Akhtirka, Izium, and Mariupol. Pain for Ukraine and the entire world, and an eternal shame for Russia. Almost 2,400 confirmed victims among the civilian population. 90% of the city's infrastructure has been destroyed. Russian troops seized one of the hospitals, gathered 400 civilians there, and used the building as a military position, hiding behind civilians as a human shield. Let me quote, "The sufferings of Mariupol must not become the future of Ukraine," end of quote, said by Peter Maurer, the ICRC president, who is currently in Ukraine. The plan of Putin is to violate the agreements on ceasefire and safe passage for the civilian population from the temporarily occupied territories. Yesterday, Russian troops shelled a convoy of civilian vehicles headed from Mariupol to Zaporizhia. 5 people were killed, many injured, including children. And the plan is previously approved to terrorize local residents who remain in the territories seized by Russian troops. Small villages where the Russian soldiers stay suffer the most. Russians break into houses, throw people out into the streets, take their food. Eyewitness reports of tortures, abductions of local officials, and even extrajudicial killings come from across the occupied territories. Enforcing Ukrainians to flee their homes as refugees has also been a part of this Barbarossa-style plan. Almost 3.2 million refugees have left Ukraine so far. Against the backdrop of the increasingly aggravated humanitarian situation, Russia has dared to table a draft humanitarian resolution of the Security Council. An appeal by a serial killer to the UN members to co-sponsor this most egregious hypocrisy is outrageous. They may like to think twice if they want before they dive into the blood of children and adults executed by the Russian military in Ukraine. And let me quote St. Patrick in this regard. Never trust a dog to watch your food. At the same time, there is no doubt that action on the humanitarian front in the UN is urgently required, and I encourage all responsible nations to support the relevant efforts in the General Assembly. I also encourage all to join the group of Friends of Accountability following the aggression against Ukraine, co-founded by Albania, Colombia, Denmark, the Marshall Islands, the Netherlands, and Ukraine. This group will act as a forum among UN member states for the discussion and promotion of accountability measures in Ukraine following the Russian military aggression. Distinguished members of the Security Council, yesterday, the International Court of Justice delivered its order on provisional measures in the case concerning allegations of genocide under the Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Ukraine versus Russian Federation. The court ordered that the Russian Federation shall immediately suspend the military operations that it commenced on the 24th February 2022 in the territory of Ukraine. Despite the order being binding on Russia under the UN Charter, today the Kremlin has openly and blatantly disregarded it, stating that they, and I quote, cannot take this order into account, end of quote, because there is no, I quote, agreement between the sides, end of quote. And should it be surprising for us? I don't think so. As from the very first instance of Russia's presence in the UN, it was in contempt of the UN Charter. That was the case when Russia was allowed to occupy the Soviet seat in the UN and the Security Council. That was the case in Georgia, in Syria, as well as in Ukraine's Crimea and Donbass in 2014. I encourage the Security Council members to exercise their duties envisaged by the Article 94.2 of the UN Charter to make recommendations or decide upon measures to be taken in the case of Russia's failure to comply with the obligations incumbent upon it under the judgment rendered by the court. Mr. President, perpetration-induced traumatic stress, although known as PITS, is a form of post-traumatic stress disorder. Its symptoms are caused by being an active participant in causing trauma. Sufferers of PITS may be found in many roles, such as soldiers, or executioners, where they are expected to cause trauma, including death. But diplomats, especially here in the United Nations, especially here in the Security Council, compared to the more well-known and understood PTSD, there appears to be greater severity and different symptom patterns for those affected by PITS. The case of the military aggression of Russia against Ukraine and the mass atrocities perpetrated by the Russian army, ordered by Putin, and defended by the Russian diplomats, will be examined by scholars and scientists, including in the areas of sociology, history, philosophy, psychiatry, and theology. Today, however, I would like to quote from Into the Abyss, a documentary about executioners of the death penalty. One guard began crying and shaking uncontrollably when, I quote, "the eyes of all the inmates he had executed began flashing before him," end of quote. Ambassador, do the eyes of Ukrainian children, women, and elderly killed by the Russians flash before you? If they do, we may consider how to sponsor a decision to help you deal with perpetration-induced traumatic stress. But now have some decency and stop the egregious manipulation of the Security Council. It is obscene. It would be too much dignifying for the Russian delegation if I ended like here, like that. Instead, I would like to quote a tweet by Dario Franceschini, the Italian member of the government, who tweeted today, "Italy is ready to rebuild the theater in Mariupol. The Cabinet of Ministers has approved my proposal to offer Ukraine the resources and means to rebuild it as soon as possible. Theaters of all countries belong to the whole humanity," end of quote. And I thank you.
أشكر ممثل أوكرانيا على
I thank the
بيانه
representative of
وأعطي
Ukraine for
الكلمة
his statement
لممثل
and give
بولندا.
the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, distinguished members of Security Council, I would like to thank Undersecretary General and the briefers for their important interventions today. And I shall start by paying tribute to the fearless Ukrainian soldiers and civilians alike who defend their homeland, freedom, and the UN Charter. They fight also for those who were forced to flee. I should also express gratitude to the work done by the UN OCHA, UNHCR, WHO, and its partners for maintaining their presence across Ukraine and continuing to deliver the assistance. Excellencies, the Security Council has gathered here today to discuss the fastest growing humanitarian and refugee crisis since the Second World War, the consequence of the Russian aggression on Ukraine. In light of this, I would like to stress the following points. Firstly, this is 100% a war of choice, and the methods of waging it is also the matter of choice. It is Russia that decided to refer to brutal force, indiscriminate weapons, as well as brutal siege tactics. Now they go as far as targeting journalists and kidnapping mayors of Ukrainian cities. In other words, the aggressor decided to change the nature of this conflict. It is a clear manifestation that Russia deliberately chose to create a humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine and bluntly disregards all the principles of international humanitarian law. And this should worry us all. Actually, disregarding the international law has been a pattern that Russia pursued in Syria and other places. To underpin this approach, earlier today, the Kremlin has rejected an order by the International Court of Justice and the United Nations highest court, to cease its attack on Ukraine. Secondly, without resolving the dire humanitarian situation, there will be no peace. Therefore, we urge Russia to change its military modus operandi and allow full and unimpeded humanitarian access and relief to those in need. The safe passage of civilians from different cities affected by the conflict must be allowed. Take the situation in Mariupol, where still around 350,000 residents remain trapped in the city as food, water, and medicines continue to dry up. These people require urgent humanitarian assistance and are exposed to safety and security risks. Therefore, we call for immediate ceasefire and humanitarian access to most affected areas. Thirdly, the humanitarian consequences of the ongoing war are not limited to Ukrainians in their own home territory. Those who had fled remain affected too. Already more than 3 million were forced to leave Ukraine as a result of Russia's military aggression. We have already reached the number of over 1.9 million people who crossed our border since February 24th. Most of them found a shelter in Poland. We have registered already 170 nationalities on our border. That means it considers us all, and we are all the victims of this aggression. Excellencies, as a neighbor and close friend of Ukraine, we see firsthand the dramatic humanitarian consequences of this war. Every day on the Polish-Ukrainian border, we are witnessing a growing number of people who cross the border severely traumatized. We believe that the involvement of UN bodies and agencies experienced in dealing with this kind of needs, together with the continued efforts of the Polish authorities, will bring rapid and appropriate solution. In the spirit of solidarity, Poland will continue to admit and provide shelter, food, healthcare, and safety to every person in need, regardless of their nationality, race, or religion's creed. Aside from the institutional care, thousands of Polish people are organizing in a bottom-up way, showing the solidarity with Ukraine, opening their homes to refugees, and volunteering at reception centers. Excellencies, as I'm delivering this speech, Poland's president's spouse, Agata Kornhauser-Duda, is building up an international coalition of first ladies and highnesses and all the peoples of goodwill to effectively protect those in vulnerable situations, namely women, children, elderly persons, and persons with disabilities, many of them with post-traumatic disorder. The Polish government has urgently implemented new immigration measures for Ukrainian citizens fleeing their country. The new law that took effect on Monday legalizes the stay of citizens of Ukraine in order to enable them to take up employment and provide them with healthcare, education, and accommodation in Poland. It also offers temporary financial help to Polish citizens who welcomed refugees in their homes. Ukrainian citizens may apply for one-time subsidy to answer their basic needs. The government will allocate funds for schooling of Ukrainian students. Every Ukrainian citizen fleeing the war has been guaranteed the access to the public healthcare system in the same way as Polish citizens have. We will continue to provide assistance to Ukrainian citizens fleeing the horrors of war brought on them by Russia. And I can tell you already we got 45,000 of pupils subscribed to Polish schools from Ukraine. But we and the other countries of the region, which I see the ambassadors here in the room, we all need
that applies to many US-sponsored laboratories around the world.
Mr. Ambassador, the Secretary General said that nobody will win this war. Everybody will lose. We believe that is true. Welcome.
Are you planning to use biological weapons?
fuel on fire.
Yeah, nobody should. But who is putting fuel on fire except the Russian army?
But so you think what? Any improvement on the end of this horrible war?
Could you step behind that tape so that all the camera can?
Hi, all right. Are you still paranoid with COVID? No. Anyway, tell me. Any improvement? No, there is no improvement. The actions of the Russian Federation continue to be very brazen, and the atrocities are taking place every day, unfortunately.
Tomorrow, the President of the United States is going to speak with the leader of China because he's going to ask that China is not going to help. No. The question is, from what the Chinese ambassador said today, what is
Do
your
I look
sense?
like a Chinese spokesperson? I don't think you.
Is your president going to speak to the General Assembly?
Can I ask you, after many weeks of putting questions to me, can you identify yourself, please?
Chelsea Lineback from Pass Blue.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yes. Is your president going to speak to the General Assembly?
When the time comes, he may. All right. Have a good day. Goodbye.
Thank you.